Chapter 7. Shasta is out at the tombs by himself, thinking they might have left him, and just at the end of the last chapter, 2 horses, and it was Bree and Hwin, showed up, but not with Arvis, with some man that he doesn't know, and so he's hiding behind one of the tombs and he doesn't know what to do. Chapter 7. Arvis in Tashbaan. I think we just heard the story about what happened to Shasta in Tashbaan, and I think now we're going to hear the story about what happened to Arvis. And they both happened at the same time, but you can only tell one part of a story at a time. So you kind of get 2 stories, even though they happened at the same time. Okay? It's like a double treat. Arvis in Tashbaan. What had really happened was this. When Arvis saw Shasta hurried away by the Narnians and found herself alone with 2 horses who, very wisely, wouldn't say a word, she never lost her head even for a moment. She grabbed Bree's halter and stood still, holding both the horses. And though her heart was beating as hard as a hammer, she did nothing to show it. As soon as the Narnian lords had passed, she tried to move on again, but before she could take even one step, another crier, "Bother all these people," thought Arvis, was heard shouting out, "Way, way, way, way for the Tarkina Lasaraleen." And immediately following the crier came 4 armed slaves and then 4 bearers carrying a litter which was all aflutter with silken curtains and all a-jingle with silver bells, and which scented the whole street with perfumes and flowers. After the litter, female slaves in beautiful clothes, and then a few grooms, runners, pages, and the like. And now Arvis made her first mistake. She knew Lasaraleen quite well, almost as if they had been at school together, because they had often stayed in the same houses and been to the same parties. And Arvis couldn't help looking up to see what Lasaraleen looked like now that she was married, and a very great person indeed. It was fatal. The eyes of the 2 girls met, and immediate Lasaraleen sat up in the litter and burst out at the top of her voice, "Arvis, what on earth are you doing here? Your father—" There was not a moment to lose. Without a second's delay, Arvis let go of the horses, caught the edge of the litter, swung herself up beside Lasaraleen, and whispered furiously in her ear, "Shut up. Do you hear me? Shut up. You must hide me. Tell your people—" "But darling," began Lasaraleen in the same loud voice. She didn't in the least mind making people stare. In fact, she rather liked it. And when Arvis was saying, shut up, it's because she was in danger and she was scared. She never would have said that otherwise, because it's not a nice thing to say. "Do what I tell you or I'll never speak to you again," hissed Arvis. "Please, please be quick, Laz. It's frightfully important. Tell your people to bring those 2 horses along. Pull all the curtains of the litter and get away somewhere where I can't be found. And do hurry." So here's when Lasaraleen was, see, that's the litter, the thing that she's laying on. It's not like trash. It's like a bed that you lay on. And it's got all those fancy things in it. And she apparently likes to talk loudly. "All right, darling," said Lasaraleen in her lazy voice. "Here, 2 of you take the Tarkina's horses." She said this to the slaves. "And now home. I say, darling, do you think we really want the curtains drawn on a day like this? I mean to say—" But Arvis had already drawn the curtains, enclosing Lasaraleen and herself in a rich and scented, but rather stuffy kind of tent. "I mustn't be seen," said Arvis. "My father doesn't know I'm here. I'm running away." "My dear, how perfectly thrilling," said Lasaraleen. "I'm dying to hear all about it. Darling, you're sitting on my dress. Do you mind? That's better. It is a new one. Do you like it? I got it at—" "Oh, Laz, do be serious," said Arvis. "Where is my father?" "Didn't you know?" said Lasaraleen. "He's here, of course. He came to town yesterday, and he's asking about you everywhere. And to think of you and me being here together and his not knowing anything about it. It's the funniest thing I ever heard." And she went off into giggles. She always had been a terrible giggler, as Arvis now remembered. It isn't funny at all, said Aravis. It's dreadfully serious. Where can you hide me? Oh, no difficulty at all, my dear girl, said Lasaraleen. I'll take you home. My husband's away, and no one will see you. Phew, it's not much fun with the curtains drawn. I want to see people. There's no point in having a new dress on if no one's going to go about if... Oh, sorry. There's no point in having a new dress on if one's to go about shut up like this, so that no one can see it. I hope no one heard you when you shouted out to me like that, said Aravis. No, of course, darling, said Lasaraleen absent-mindedly. But you haven't even told me yet what you think of the dress. Another thing, said Aravis, you must tell your people to treat those 2 horses very respectfully. That's part of the secret. They're really talking horses from Narnia. Fancy, said Lasaraleen. How exciting. And oh, darling, have you seen the barbarian queen from Narnia? She's staying in Tashbaan at present. They say Prince Rabidash is madly in love with her. There have been the most wonderful parties with hunts and things all this last fortnight. I can't see that she's so pretty myself, but some of the Narnian men are lovely. I was taken out on a river party the day before yesterday, and I was wearing my... How shall we prevent your people telling everyone that you've got a visitor, dressed like a beggar's brat, in your house, said Aravis. It might so easily get round to your father. Now don't keep fussing, there's a dear, said Lasaraleen. We'll get you some proper clothes in a moment. And here we are. The bears had stopped, and the litter was being lowered. When the curtains had been drawn, Aravis found that she was in a courtyard garden, very like the one that Shasta had been taken into a few minutes earlier in another part of the city. See, this is happening at the same time. Lasaraleen would have gone indoors at once, but Aravis reminded her in a frantic whisper to say something to the slaves about not telling anyone of their mistress's strange visitor. Sorry, darling, it had gone right out of my head, said Lasaraleen. Here, all of you, and you doorkeeper, no one is to be let out of the house today, and anyone I catch talking about this young lady will be first beaten to death, and then burned alive, and after that be kept on bread and water for 6 weeks. There. Although Lasaraleen had said she was dying to hear Aravis's story, she showed no sign of really wanting to hear it at all. She was, in fact, much better at talking than at listening. And the best kind of friends are the ones who are really good at listening and talking together. But if all you do is talk and don't listen... She insisted on Aravis having a long and luxurious bath. Calormen baths are famous. And then dressing her up in the finest clothes before she would let her explain anything. The fuss she made about choosing the dresses nearly drove Aravis mad. She remembered now that Lasaraleen had always been like that, interested in clothes and parties and gossip. Aravis had always been more interested in bows and arrows and horses and dogs and swimming. You will guess that each thought the other silly. But when at last they were both seated after a meal, it was chiefly of the whipped cream and jelly and fruit and ice sort of meal, in a beautiful pillared room, which Aravis would have liked better if Lasaraleen's spoiled pet monkey hadn't been climbing about it all the time. Lasaraleen at last asked her why she was running away from home. When Aravis had finished telling her story, Lasaraleen said, "But, darling, why don't you marry a Hoshta Tarkhan? Everybody's crazy about him. My husband says he's beginning to be one of the greatest men in Calormen. He's just been made Grand Vizier now that old Axartha has died. Didn't you know?" Here they are. This one is Aravis, because you can recognize her from the girl who was sitting in that fancy little bed with the curtains on it. And there's the pet monkey that apparently is just annoying. "I don't care," said Aravis. "I can't stand the sight of him." "But, darling, only think. 3 palaces, and one of them that beautiful one down on the lake at Akeen. Positively ropes of pearls, I'm told. Baths of ass's milk. And you'd see such a lot of me." "He can keep his pearls and palaces as far as I'm concerned," said Aravis. "You always were a strange girl, Aravis," said Lasaraleen. "What more do you want?" In the end, however, Aravis managed to make her friend believe that she was in earnest, and even to discuss plans. There would be no difficulty now about getting the 2 horses out of the north gate and then onto the tombs. No one would stop or question a groom in fine clothes leading a war horse and a lady's saddle horse down to the river. And Lasaraleen had plenty of grooms to send. It wasn't so easy to decide what to do about Aravis herself. She suggested that she could be carried out in the litter with the curtains drawn. But Lasaraleen told her that litters were only used in the city, and the sight of one going out through the gates would be certain to lead to questions. When they had talked for a long time, and it was all the longer because Aravis found it hard to keep her friend to the point, at last Lasaraleen clapped her hands and said, "Oh, I have an idea. There is one way of getting out of the city without using the gates. The Tisrock's garden, may he live forever, runs right down to the water, and there's a little water door, only for the palace people, of course. But then you know, dear," here she giggled a little, "we almost are palace people. I say, it is lucky for you that you came to me. The dear Tisrock, may he live forever, is so kind. We're asked to the palace almost every day, and it's like a second home. I love all the dear princes and princesses, and I positively adore Prince Rabidash. I might run in and see any of the palace ladies at any hour of the day or night. Why shouldn't I slip in with you after dark and let you out by the water door? There are always a few punts and things tied up outside it." Punts are a little boat. "And even if we were caught," Aravis said, "all would be lost." "Oh, darling, don't get so excited," said Lasaraleen. "I was going to say, even if we were caught, everyone would only say it was one of my mad little jokes. I'm getting quite well known for them. Only the other day, do listen, dear, this is frightfully funny." "I meant all would be lost for me," said Aravis a little sharply. "Oh, yes, I do see what you mean, darling. Well, can you think of any better plan?" Aravis couldn't, and she answered, "No, we'll have to risk it. When can we start?" "Oh, not tonight," said Lasaraleen. "Of course not tonight. There's a great feast on tonight. I must start getting my hair done for it in a few minutes, and the whole place will be a blaze of lights, and such a crowd, too. It would have to be tomorrow night." This was bad news for Aravis, but she had to make the best of it. The afternoon passed very slowly, and it was a relief when Lasaraleen went out to the banquet, for Aravis was very tired of her giggling and her talk about dresses and parties, weddings and engagements and scandals. She went to bed early, and that part she did enjoy. It was so nice to have pillows and sheets again. But the next day passed very slowly. So that night was the night that Shasta was sleeping out in the tombs by himself with the cat, right? The next day passed very slowly. Lasaraleen wanted to go back on the whole arrangement and kept on telling Aravis that Narnia was a country of perpetual snow and ice, inhabited by demons and sorcerers, and she was mad to think of going there. "And with a peasant boy, too," said Lasaraleen. "Darling, think of it. It's not nice." Aravis had thought of it a good deal, but she was so tired of Lasaraleen's silliness by now that, for the first time, she began to think that traveling with Shasta was really rather more fun than fashionable life in Tashbaan. So she only replied, "You forget that I'll be nobody just like him when we get to Narnia. And anyway, I promised." "And to think," said Lasaraleen, almost crying, "that if only you had sense, you could be the wife of a grand vizier." Aravis went away to have a private word with the horses. "You must go with the groom a little before sunset down to the tombs," she said. "No more of those packs. You'll be saddled and bridled again, but there'll have to be food in Hwyn's saddlebags and a full water skin behind yours, Bree. The man has orders to let you both have a good long drink at the far side of the bridge." "And then Narnia and the North," whispered Bree. "But what if Shasta is not at the tombs?" "Wait for him, of course," said Aravis. "I hope you've been quite comfortable." "Never better stabled in my life," said Bree. "But if the husband of that tittering Tarkina friend of yours is paying his head groom to get the best oats, then I think the head groom is cheating him." Oats are what the horses eat. Aravis and Lasaraleen had supper in the pillared room. About 2 hours later, they were ready to start. Aravis was dressed to look like a superior slave girl in a great house, and she wore a veil over her face. They had agreed that if any questions were asked, Lasaraleen would pretend that Aravis was a slave that she was taking as a present to one of the princesses. The two girls went out on foot. A very few minutes brought them to the palace gates. Here there were, of course, soldiers on guard, but the officer knew Lasaraleen quite well and called his men to attention and saluted. They passed at once into the hall of black marble. A fair number of courtiers, slaves, and others were still moving about here, but this only made the two girls less conspicuous. They passed on into the hall of pillars, and then into the hall of statues, and down the colonnade, passing the great beaten copper doors of the throne room. It was all magnificent beyond description, what they could see of it in the dim light of the lamps. Presently, they came out into the garden court, which sloped downhill in a number of terraces. On the far side of that, they came to the old palace. It had already grown almost quite dark, and they now found themselves in a maze of corridors lit only by occasional torches fixed in brackets to the walls. Lasaraleen halted at a place where you had to go either left or right. "Go on, do go on," whispered Aravis, whose heart was beating terribly, and who still felt that her father might run into them at any corner. "I'm just wondering," said Lasaraleen. "I'm not absolutely sure which way we go from here. I think it's the left. Yes, I'm almost sure it's the left. What fun this is." They took the left-hand way and found themselves in a passage that was hardly lighted at all, and which soon began going down steps. "It's all right," said Lasaraleen. "I'm sure we're right now. I remember these steps." But at that moment, a moving light appeared ahead. A second later, there appeared another from around a distant corner, the dark shapes of two men who were walking backwards and carrying tall candles. And of course, it's only before royalty that people walk backward. Aravis felt Lasaraleen grip her arm, that sort of sudden grip which is almost a pinch and which means that the person who is gripping you is very frightened indeed. Aravis thought it odd that Lasaraleen should be so afraid of the Tisroc if he were really such a good friend of hers. But there was no time to go on thinking. Lasaraleen was hurrying her back to the top of the steps, on tiptoes, and groping wildly along the wall. "Here's a door," she whispered. "Quick!" They went in, drew the door softly behind them, and found themselves in pitch darkness. Aravis could hear by Lasaraleen's breathing that she was terrified. "Tosh, preserve us," whispered Lasaraleen. "What shall we do if he comes in here? Can we hide?" There was a soft carpet under their feet. They groped forward into the room and blundered onto a sofa. "Let's lie down behind it," whimpered Lasaraleen. "Oh, I do wish we hadn't come." There was just room between the sofa and the curtained wall, and the two girls got down. Lasaraleen managed to get the better position and was completely covered. The upper part of Aravis's face stuck out behind the sofa, so that if anyone came into that room with a light and happened to look in exactly the right place, they would see her. But of course, because she was wearing a veil, what they saw would not at once look like a forehead and a pair of eyes. Aravis shoved desperately to try and make Lasaraleen give her a little more room, but Lasaraleen, now quite selfish in her panic, fought back and pinched her feet. They gave it up and lay still, panting a little. Their own breath seemed dreadfully noisy, but there was no other noise. "Is it safe?" said Aravis at last in the tiniest possible whisper. "I think so," began Lasaraleen, "but my poor nerves." And then came the most terrible noise they could have heard at that moment, the noise of the door opening. And then came light, and because Aravis couldn't get her head any further in behind the sofa, she saw everything. First came the two slaves. They were deaf and dumb, as Aravis rightly guessed, meaning they couldn't hear and they couldn't speak. And therefore, they were used at the most secret councils. They walked in backwards, carrying the candles. They took up their stand, one at each end of the sofa. This was a good thing, for of course it was now harder for anyone to see Aravis once a slave was standing in front of her, and she was looking between his heels. Then came an old man, very fat, wearing a curious pointed cap by which she immediately knew that he was the Tisroc. The least of the jewels with which he was covered was worth more than all the clothes and weapons of the Narnian lords put together. But he was so fat and such a mass of frills and pleats and baubles and buttons and tassels and talismans that Aravis couldn't help thinking the Narnian fashions, at any rate for the men, looked nicer. After him came a tall young man with a feathered and jeweled turban on his head and an ivory-sheathed scimitar at his side. He seemed very excited, and his eyes and teeth flashed fiercely in the candlelight. Last of all came a little hump-backed, wizen old man in whom she recognized with a shudder the new Grand Vizier, her own betrothed husband, Ahoshta Tarkhan himself. As soon as all three had entered the room and the door was shut, the Tisroc seated himself on the divan with a sigh of contentment, and the young man took his place standing before him, and the Grand Vizier got down on his knees and elbows and laid his face flat on the carpet. Okay, just hang on a moment. That's the end of the chapter, by the way. But I thought there was a picture of Aravis behind the couch, hiding, but I don't see one in here. So I must have just imagined it. Okay, all right. That is the end of chapter 7. And even though there's 15 chapters in the book, which means when you get to the middle of chapter 7, you're halfway through, by page number, we're almost halfway through already. Look at that. Chapter 8, which we'll read next, is called In the House of the Tisroc. So this must be what happens in that room where Aravis and Lasaraleen are. Well, Shasta has probably just met the horses because it's that night, and they're waiting, wondering where Aravis is. I hope that she gets out okay and that she gets to meet them at the tombs. But we don't know yet. We'll find out in the next chapter.